This is the episode 1 of the Petroleum Excise Tax podcast. Your host today, Patrick McGinty.
I got an idea for a title. I'm a fuel for you. No?
I'm a fuel for
Don't be fuelish?
Don't be foolish. I kind of like it. I'm a fuel for you.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to work on
We'll
the
give
title.
you the undyed truth about
That's a little too
condensates. Yeah.
I was trying to think of the I was trying to distill the truth out of the crude issue.
Ah, okay. That's naphtha gonna happen. What do you call it when you? It's not distilling, but what do you call that big tower where you take off the ethane at the top and the sludge at the bottom and
The
refinery?
crack tower, or not the crack tower? It's the that's the refinery itself. That's the petroleum cracking. It's not the cracking unit. I'll have to look at that. It's a large tower, and basically they boil the fuel. They boil the crude oil when it comes in,
and the lighter stuff comes off on top.
And it's interesting because it's ancient technology as far as it's well over 100 years old.
Oh, yeah. Well, gosh, how long has distilling alcohol been around? At least since George Washington, a lot longer than that.
Mm-hmm. And so it's just a variation on that. And it's funny, the things in chemistry. Somebody figured out that if you made a long tube and made it vertical, for some reason that improves the distillation process. That I have never heard a good explanation why a long, tall distillation unit would work better than a horizontal one.
I was reading it has something to do with countercyclic steam. Is as it goes up, it cools, but it cools in a nice steady way, so that the alcohol, partial pressure, it comes out at a different point, and it's kind of like the most efficient way to get all of it out. Now, they didn't have that back in George Washington's time, so literally you had to boil it off. It went through like a copper tube and ended up in another vessel. Then you had to boil that vessel again through a copper tube, and then it was stronger, so you had to go stage, stage. But with a vertical tube, you got a perfect, it's like a million stages all at once.
Oh.
So you have to just tap. It's a tube, and they fill it with. You can use rocks or bits of hunks of steel or something. They actually sell special little cubes that are Teflon coated with maximum surface area and stuff like that. But that's basically what they use now, and that hasn't been improved in a while.
Wow. The from an excise tax standpoint, refining is pretty unexciting because there's only one excise tax that's applicable to crude oil, and that's an excise tax that's paid on a per barrel basis. And by definition, a barrel of crude oil is 42 gallons. It's kind of interesting the history that I've heard on why a barrel of oil is 42 gallons. I thought was funny. Have you heard the?
No, I haven't.
It dates back to the late 1800s or probably mid 1800s. After they started actually drilling wells, they would send wagons out with wine barrels, and the wine barrels they would fill. And then, of course, the roads were really poor back then because they were basically dirt roads, mud roads. If you were lucky, you had roads that were a combination of logs and dirt, nothing smooth. And by the time the barrel got back to the collection point from the wellhead, basically 8 gallons out of the 50 gallons you started with had spilled along the way. We won't even begin to talk about the environmental hazards.
Oh yeah, well I suppose it's really hard to make handmade wooden barrels very tight. and then bounce them around.
Yeah, it was just they wouldn't seal them, or if they did seal them, they would open up into jostling in a wagon without shock absorbers. You literally spilled a lot of the oil along the way, and so they deemed that a barrel would be 42 gallons after that. So when you have a barrel of crude arrive at a refinery, or it is subject to a 8-cent per barrel tax. It's and known in the industry as the fossil tax.
Now, is there any difference between oil that arrives at the refinery domestically versus imported?
They don't care. It's when it arrives. And refined petroleum products are subject to the tax at the same rate when they're imported into the country, but crude oil isn't taxed until it hits the refinery.
Oh, so you import gas and it gets the same.
You put it on. And the fossil stands for Federal Oil Spill Liability Tax, and it's a cyclical tax in that they impose the tax until they raise enough funds to populate and fund a trust account that's used to clean up oil spills, and then when that funding it reaches a selected statutory amount, like $1 billion or whatever they decide, then they turn the tax off until they deplete the fund, and then they start it up again.
That sounds like it would be more work than to just keep charging the tax.
Well, they do it for this is not uncommon. It's not real common, but it's not uncommon in the industry for states to have funds that they deplete and reinvigorate on a regular basis.
Oh, okay. So they just make sure the fund never gets full.
Never gets empty.
Never gets, well, if it got full, they would stop collecting the tax.
Yeah, they from an administrative standpoint, and this is for the convenience of the state or federal administrator, it's a lot easier for them to turn on and turn off a tax rather than adjust the rate over time to try and project how much tax.
Oh, I would think the easiest thing would just be keep tapping into the fund.
You're getting into a whole different complexity of dealing with the bureaucracies that I don't begin to understand. But that's the fossil is the first tax to hit petroleum products.
And that's a state tax?
That's a federal tax. Federal
okay.
Oil Spill Liability Tax.
About how much do they raise from that?
Let's see. There are in the United States, the rule of thumb is if you raise there's about 100 billion gallons of motor fuel used every year, and most of the petroleum used in the United States is motor fuel. So at 42 gallons a barrel, you figure that you're about
4.2 trillion gallons.
Yeah.
8 cents
8 cents a barrel. So it gets, you're probably talking $300 million a year.
Oh, okay.
Or 30 million, one of those factors.
It's supposed to roughly match the highway fund, right?
No, the highway fund's a totally separate. It's Congress has various funds they set up throughout the government, and the problem being is that the funds have statutory requirements upon what they can expend money on, and what they can't, which is one of the issues with the oil spill. If you have a long period with no major oil spills, you're not going to deplete your fund, and so there's no reason to have the tax.
Yeah.
As opposed to the highway fund, which is constantly being depleted for new highway projects and congressional elections.
I was just reading something or hearing something. It was after the Grant administration in the late 1800s. They basically passed a law saying they must spend what Congress apportions for a project. They can't spend less than what Congress apportions, and they have to distribute it every 12. It was then revised in 1906 to say they had to spend the correct amount every month. So basically, when Congress sets aside some money for it, the president can't say, "Oh, I'm not going to spend that money." He has to spend the money. And if the president wants to spend more than that, he says, "No, I can't spend. You can't spend more than that. You have to spend what Congress apportioned for it."
Sounds like an anti-line item veto legislation to prevent the one administration from counteracting the will of Congress.
Yeah, it's a separation of powers thing.
Interesting. Games. So back to the world of excise tax, and you raise a good point. The excise taxes are raised for specific purposes in the world of petroleum products. There is the funding of highways, and there's the funding of airports, are the two major ones I'm aware of and the ones I deal with. And the two are separate trust funds, but they're collected in the same manner. And the amount of collection is based upon the fuel type or the fuel component. The presumption is that a great many of the products that are made, like toluene and butane, will eventually end up as additives to gasoline, and so there's a presumption of use.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're dealing with products like that, and you're in a taxable situation, you have to be aware that even though nobody uses butane in their car at this point, having butane may be subjecting you to tax.
Uh-huh. Now, butane, see, that's a liquid?
Butane is a gas that liquefies at, I believe, 40 below zero.
Yeah, I know. I thought that's what they used in Bic lighters, and it seems like there's a liquid inside Bic lighters.
It is because it's pressurized. When you have a gas and you put it under sufficient pressure, it will convert to a liquid.
Oh, interesting.
So that's why the butane lighter works. You can put a small amount of liquid in there, which is a huge volume of gas. And as you open the valve to ignite the lighter, it reduces the pressure, causing the liquid to boil and replenish the pressure. And it'll only boil to the extent where the vapor pressure reaches the point where it becomes a liquid again.
Interesting, and they can fit all that inside a plastic case. Oh, I never knew that.
It's pretty amazing.
This has been a really interesting podcast.
And it's funny because way back in the dark ages, one of the first butane lighters I saw was a high quality Zippo, and you had to go through quite the process to do it. You had a container of butane about the size of a toothpaste tube, and you actually had to screw it into the bottom of the lighter, and then that would open the valve, allowing the lighter to fill with the liquid.
I think I remember things like that. And then they get the ones that had just a pressure connect fitting too that came along a little later, but still it was a kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting event because there was always a little loss of this super cold fluid, and that was converting to gas, and that was exciting. So the petroleum products taxing environment revolves around motor fuels, and like I was saying, the presumption is that the fuel is going to be used in motor, or the petroleum crude is going to be used in motor fuels, even though a huge amount of it goes into ethylene and other components.
Tar, asphalt, or...
Well,
not really.
I think you raise a good point. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about the distillation process. And I'm by no means a chemist, but I know enough just to keep my own mind clear about what happens in the process. You take crude oil at the refinery and you heat it up, and then you enter it into the distillation tower, where it is further heated, and they heat this by actually burning off components of the fuel. You can either burn the gas to heat it, and so you've got this large cylinder that is heated very hot to quite a temperature. And of course, like you're saying, crude oil is actually a solution of many different fluids and gases. There's methane in it, there's ethane, there's butane, there's propane.
I read somewhere that that gas that's flared off, that people drive by and they say, oh, they're wasting all that gas. It's actually full of so many corrosive compounds that it can't really be used for anything. Did I get that right?
The each petroleum reservoir has its own mixture of compounds, and you can go from one extreme, which would be just a gas field, which could be pure methane gas, and methane gas is the simplest hydrocarbon. You could have that, or you can go to the other extreme where you have very heavy crude, such as the tar sands, which is almost asphalt in its consistency, and yet those are both components of crude. So when you have crude oil, a lot of crude oil is fairly thin and runny, and the more of the lighter liquids that you have, such as naphtha.
Well, I'm reading there's gas that they call wet gas, which is just gas that still has some liquids in it.
Well, and what you've got then is dry gas is methane, and the methane is the lightest and the simplest hydrocarbon. Let's see if I got this right. You've got methane, ethane, butane, pentane,
propane,
and that's the last gas. And then you get into the liquids, and a couple more up. So the wet gas is
benzene, and yeah.
The wet gas is referred to as which has condensates in it, because if you reduce the temperature or increase the pressure, you'll actually condense liquids out of the gas, and those can be very valuable. The Northeast has a fairly dry gas, and which is not good for transportation, but it does have a fair amount of ethane in it, which is a critical component for the chemical industry in plastics. A lot of the vinyl chloride, a lot of the
polyvinyl chloride.
Polyvinyl chloride, I think, is ethane based, and again, consult your local chemist for the actual specifics. But there's a resurgence in the plastics industry in the Northeast because of they've got so much ethane they don't know what to do with it. And so obviously, if you've got a large quantity of something that's useful and it's cheap, why not make plastics out of it?
Sure.
So what we're dealing with the crude oil is, for the transportation industry, you want the lighter to middle distillates, they're referred to, and the light distillates are the gases and the butane and propane, and then the middle distillates are the naphtha, gasoline, kerosene, and then you get into the fuel oils. I have no idea how they came up with these names. Fuels, I can't remember if it's fuels, oils, or fuel oils, but those are getting into the heavier, thicker fluids, and then you get into the heavy final product. The ultimate portion of the crude oil is asphalt, and I'll talk more about that a little later.
Okay. Thanks for talking about this, and we'll be back with another episode of
this. This is Fuelish Patrick. Fuelish Patrick.
I'm a fuel for you.
I'm a fuel for you. I like it.